Oh, I need that. Almost ready here. Okay. All right. So, welcome back to another talk about behaviorism and meaning. Today I'm talking about Charles W. Morris, who you see there. Let me give you let me show you where we are in the chronology of behaviorism. This is so Charles Morris, 1901, 1979. Those are his dates. So we're getting along here in history. Morris was a major figure in semiotics. Just tell you a few facts about him. A few notable facts and figures. Major figure in semiotics, the study of signs. Started more or less in America by the American version, I should say. It was started more or less by Charles Peirce, who I talked about earlier in another video. He was very much influenced by George Herbert Mead, who I also have done a video on. He was a student of Mead's, and but he was also influenced by other pragmatists, especially Peirce, I would say. Also influenced by logical positivism. This was another school of philosophy during that time. What else? So he knew Skinner's work as well. I'll talk about Skinner in the next video. And he had reviewed Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, mostly complimentary or mostly praising it, if I recall, but it's been a while since I've read his review. He also collaborated with and commented on the work of Charles Osgood, who I will also talk about in my next video. And he was a teacher of Thomas Sabbouck, I'm pronouncing that correctly, also a big figure in the field of semiotics. So I'm going to focus on one of Morris's shorter books called Signification and Significance from 1964. It streamlines his theory, I think, in a useful way. It's kind of an abstract or summary or précis of two parts of his earlier work, which are on semiotics. So we did a big book on semiotics and some other long, kind of complicated stuff on semiotics. And he also did a lot on value theory or axiology. And this book tries to bring those two things together. And it's a little bit more friendly and accessible than some of his other books, his more technical books, but it still is quite technical, as you'll see. So I recommend chapters 1 and 2 if you're interested in this sort of thing. They're short, but kind of dense. Yeah, so as I mentioned, signification and significance, he's bringing these two things together. In philosophy, these are sometimes the field known as the fields of semiotics and axiology or value theory. Okay, so significance, signification. Let me say a little bit more about that. So he begins his book by noting that there's many languages. In many languages, there's a word for meaning, like in English, and there's often two poles to this word. There's the sense in which meaning is talking about how objects or words signify something else, right? So the word cloud might indicate a particular thing, a particular object or idea, an actual cloud or the idea of a cloud. And actual objects might indicate things as well, signify things as well. So a dark, heavy cloud might signify the possibility of rain. So that's signification, what he's going to call signification. There's also significance, which is more about value or importance. When we talk about, say, the meaning of life, we're not talking about just what is the referent of that word, of the word life. We're talking about what's important, what's valuable about life. Or when objects are meaningful to us, it's not that they necessarily signify other objects or ideas or something, but they have important value to us. So the purpose of this book, he tells us, is to understand the nature of signification and significance, as well as their relations within human behavior. So first we're going to talk about signification, and hopefully I can do this successfully this time. I've already tried and failed to explain his very complicated theory with many parts. We'll give it another try, see what happens. So signification, like Peirce, Morris is going to use the language of signs. He's going to talk about signs. If you remember from Peirce would talk about signs standing for an object. And Morris is doing something similar. So there's 5 key terms in Morris's semiotic theory, and here they are. There's sign interpreter, interpretant, or disposition, as he sometimes says, signification or object, and context. So it's a little more complicated than other theories we've talked about. Peirce, you had these 3 important parts: sign, object, and interpretant. And I think included, well, yeah, I don't know about for Peirce. Peirce did mention once in a while the interpreter, but I think when you talk about interpretant, it implies that there's an interpreter, so it might be redundant. And actually Morris does not really say much. He's not going to say much about the interpreter. He's also not going to say much about context. Some other behavioral semiotics people like Skinner, B.F. Skinner, and Morse Peckham, who I'll talk about in other videos, tend to combine sign and context together just because it's convenient. And yeah, so Morris has these 5 terms, but we're really going to focus on 3 of them. So you can think about whether the other 2 are even necessary. I don't know. But for Morris, a sign, let's talk about a sign. Sign could be like an image or a word, a sound, a smell, something like that. So for Morris, a sign sets up an impulse or disposition to act in a certain way, which is the interpretant, so this disposition to act in a certain way, in an interpreter in a certain context. It sets up the sign sets up this disposition in respect of a certain kind of object that is not now stimulating you. So you have the sign in lieu of the object. And that creates an impulse to act in some way towards the object which is not yet existing or not present or something like that. So similar to Peirce, for Morris, the sign stands for some object. And you have to keep in mind that object is not just like a material thing. I have many material things around me, but a material thing like a pencil. This is an object, but it's not the only kind of thing that is meant by object. It could be an event or an act, an action. Yeah, so don't take it too narrowly in the sense of a material stable thing that you can hold in your hand. So let's talk about the interpretant. We'll talk about the interpretant first. So, three-phase interpretant, and he talks about the phases of these refer kind of to the phases of the act, right? Interpretant is a disposition to act in a certain way. Action has 3 parts in the Meadian Morris behavior theory. So there's the perceptual phase, the manipulatory phase, and the consummatory phase. So this comes out of the work of Mead especially. This is Morris's description. According to Mead, if an impulse, as a disposition to a certain kind of action, is given, the resulting action has 3 phases: the perceptual, the manipulatory, and the consummatory. The organism must perceive the relevant features of the environment in which it is to act. It must behave toward these objects in a way relevant to the satisfaction of its impulse. And if all goes well, it then attains the phase of activity, which is the consummation of the act. Since act and object are correlative in his account, Mead also speaks of the distance properties of the object, its manipulatory properties, and its consummatory properties. I talked a bit about this in my video on Mead, so if you are interested in that, you can check that out. Yeah, distance, manipulatory, and consummatory. So talking about perception, perceiving something, actually grabbing it and manipulating it, doing something with it, and then the consummation, kind of the end or completion of the act. Yeah, right, so that's the interpretant or the wider act in which everything else kind of takes on its function or meaning. So let's look at the sign now. The sign which refers to some object which is not present at the time. So there's three dimensions to the sign. The tridimensionality of the sign as the designative dimension, the prescriptive dimension, and the appraisive dimension. Okay, so designative is about the observable properties of the environment or of the actor. So designative, observable, right? The properties that you can see or hear or touch or feel, whatever, smell, taste. Prescriptive signifies how the object or situation is to be reacted to, so as to satisfy the governing impulse. So prescription is like what you should do, what you ought to do. So what are you supposed to do with the object? And then appraisive signifies the consummatory properties of some object or situation. So it's easier maybe if I give an example. So if you say, please open the door, right? That's a sign. Please open the door, or it's made up of signs or whatever. I'm not exactly sure how he would describe a sentence. But there is an observable property here that's being talked about, the door, and a kind of situation that's being talked about, right? The door is closed, want the door open. And there's a kind of action that's being referred to, a kind of prescription about what to do about that object. Just open it. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to open it. And then a consummatory property, which is about the state of affairs that you would preferred state of affairs, having the door open. So if the door is open, then it's appraised as being satisfactory. All right. So more about the sign. In the perceptual phase of the act, signs are mainly designative. In the manipulatory stage, signs are mainly prescriptive. So what should you do? And then in the consummatory stage, signs are mainly appraisive. Is it satisfactory or not? Is the new state of affairs satisfactory or no? And then there are also, there's a tridimensional interpretant. So the interpretant has three dimensions. Yeah. So again, interpretant, a disposition to react in a certain kind of way because of signs, because of the signs given. So let's see if I can do this correctly. I think last time this is around where things started to go off the rails. Yes, so sensory interpretant, so kind of your response, the interpreter's response to the sign, has these three parts: sensory, behavioral, and autonomic or emotional. Try to make this clear. So in the perceptual phase of the act, the interpretant is, so when you're talking about designative signs, focusing on the designative aspect of signs, the response is sensory. So you're using your sensory apparatus, sensory interpretant, right? You're using your senses. A disposition, he says, to react to the designated object as if it had certain observable properties. So in the manipulatory phase of the act, you have right, you're paying attention to the prescriptive aspects of the sign, of the information given to you. So what am I supposed to do? Now I see the object, what am I supposed to do with it? So, and this is a behavioral interpretant, or he also says somatic or motor. So motor kind of goes with sensory motor system. So motor is like, what am I actually going to do? The motor system in your body. And then the consummatory phase of the act. So we're going down to the third point there. In the consummatory phase, signs are mainly appraisive, or you're paying attention to the appraisive dimension of the sign. And yeah, so the autonomic or emotional interpretant is a disposition to act towards a designated object as if it would be satisfying or unsatisfying. Right? So you have a feeling about it. So you perceive it, you see it, you figure out what to do with it, and you think about whether that would be satisfying or unsatisfying for you, pleasurable or unpleasurable. Yeah, you might compare this to Peirce's tridimensional interpretant. Peirce had these three interpretants also. I talked about this in my video on about him. He had many different versions of this, but one common one was the emotional interpretant, the energetic interpretant, and the logical interpretant. So emotional obviously is also on Morris's list, as is energetic, which would be the behavioral interpretant. Logical, Morris doesn't have a thing for logical, which was about habit change. If you know your Peirce, the logical interpretant was a kind of change in habit that resulted from semiosis. Okay, well, got through that maybe, a little rough, but tridimensional signification. So we've had our sign, we've had our interpretant. Now let's talk about the three parts of signification. And hopefully I've got this correct now. Tridimensional signification. Yeah, it looks right. But why do I have another slide? Oh, no, I don't. Okay. Continue. I'm fine. Tridimensional signification. So we just talked about the sensory dimension of the interpretant, which is connected to the designative properties of the sign, which is connected to the perceptual phase of the act. So here in signification, we're talking about the stimulus properties of the object, the characteristics of objects that are potentially observable, right? So sensory, we care about. I'm talking about their signification is what is observable or potentially observable, including through technologies, through scientific instruments and stuff. And then, so now we're going on to the second point. So that's in working backwards from this second point. You're in the manipulatory phase of the act. You've got the prescriptive dimension of the sign. That's important to you. You've got a behavioral interpretant going on, and what is signified is the act as instrumental, that is permitting some other act or event to happen. So when an animal in an experiment presses a lever to get food, that's the act that produces something else, right? So the act as instrumental. Pressing the lever is instrumental to getting the food. And then the last one, we're in the consummatory phase of the act. We're paying attention to appraisive signs, signs about pleasure, displeasure, pain, whatever. And we've got an autonomic or emotional interpretant. So we're feeling that this is going to be good or bad. And the signification then is about the reinforcing properties of the object, those capacities of an object that increase the probability that a certain response will be made to it. And so this really gets into the behavioristic elements, so talking about reinforcement. So what about the object is reinforcing? So the kind of the meaning of the object, it has stimulus properties, right? The first one, stimulus properties. It has instrumental properties for producing something that we want. And then reinforcing properties. So if we get what we want, then it reinforces us to do that thing again in the future. So yeah, I'm not going to try to make that better at this point. That's probably the best I can do. So this is Morris's table 1 from his book Signification and Significance. Just give a little bit of a summary here. Right. So action requirements, he has obtaining information, selection of objects for preferential behavior, action on object by specific behavior. He actually puts the consummatory stage second, I think. I don't remember why. But yeah, so I changed his order a little bit because I thought consummation and appraisive signs and stuff should come at the end if we are talking about perception, manipulation, and consummation. So he kind of does it, mixes the order up for some reason, which maybe makes sense, but I can't recall. So the order is a little different than what I talked about, but yeah. It's maybe more obvious if you look at the interpretant, disposition to respond by, sense organs, or object preferences, or behavior preferences. So I'd put behavior preferences in the middle. And then, yeah, so I mentioned the dimensions of signification, designative, appraisive, prescriptive, and the significations. So what is actually signified by a sign could be the stimulus properties of an object. If it's something that, what are you expecting to see? The reinforcing properties of the object. So is it expected to be good or bad, pleasurable, not pleasurable, something you want to do again or not? And then the signification of the act as instrumental, as giving you something that you want. So yeah, it makes more sense to do 1, 3, 2 as he has it on the table, but anyways, that's his table. All right, so what is meaning? If we're talking about signification in the first part of the book, meaning in that sense is going to be both signification and the interpretant. So if you want to define meaning, it's signification plus interpretant. All right, so let me give you an example. And this is an example he gives, but I'm rephrasing it a little bit, I think. So let's say that a dietitian, someone giving you advice about your diet, a dietitian may tell you that diet A is good and diet B is bad. So the dietitian is signifying or designating two different objects, right? These two different diets. You can eat this kind of food, or you can eat this kind of food. This kind is good, this kind is bad. So there's two different kinds of objects being signified there. And good and bad point to positively and negatively reinforcing properties of the diet, or actually I would say reinforcing and maybe aversive properties of the diets. So that's dealing with this, yeah, see the consummatory phase. Like if you take on one of these diets, either it's going to be reinforcing or not. So that's what good and bad signify. They're signifying these reinforcing or aversive, punishing properties of the diet. And of course, the dietitian is telling you this because eating the good diet is instrumental. It's instrumental to you becoming healthier, happier, maybe, and perhaps instrumental to you returning to the dietitian because they give good advice, or recommending the dietitian to your friends or something. So it's also there's also this instrumental element to it because the dietitian is not just telling you this for your enlightenment. They're telling you this because you're supposed to act on it. So you also have an interpretant, right? So when you hear this advice, this sign, and these objects being referred to, it also creates in you an interpretant, which is you may become disposed, have the disposition to notice, to shop for, and to prefer foods that are in this diet, in diet A, the good diet. Okay, so that's kind of how these things all relate. So there's the signification of the objects being referred to, the interpretant, then the disposition about how you're going to act in the face of those objects being referred to. And it's maybe worth mentioning that his terminology here is a little different than what you'll find in his earlier works. So just to beware. All right, let's go on to significance. So I want to say a little about significance, which is the other half of Morris's book. This is part of what is called either value theory or axiology. I haven't talked really about value theory with other pragmatists or behaviorists before, since it's a little bit outside of what I'm focusing on in this series of videos. But since Morris is trying to integrate these two things, I'll say a little bit about value theory or axiology here. So again, we're going to have a bunch of things in groups of three. This is this Peircean obsession with three that Morris also takes up, and other people do. We'll see that with Skinner. He's got his three-term contingency, and Peckham has his triad of meaning or something like that. So threes are popular. It may be just that it's easier to remember things in threes, not because there's some necessary law of the universe that everything needs to come in three parts. So we're going to have three kinds of values, three aspects of systems or dimensions of value, and then eventually we'll talk about three forms of inquiry at the very end. All right, so three kinds of values. We've got operative values, conceived values, and object values. I've already mentioned the word object values, I think, but we're going to talk about operative, conceived, and object values. So operative values, this is kind of like preferences, your preference for this over that. These are about the direction or tendency of your preferential behavior over time in various situations. So when presented with a choice between coffee and tea, you may in most cases choose tea. That's your object preference, not your object preference, but your operative value. That's what you prefer over time. Right? If you look at someone's behavior over time, you'll notice that they always or usually choose tea over coffee. Or, for example, if they're going to a museum, they may prefer to look at some types of art rather than other types of art. They may prefer abstract to realistic artworks. So that's something that you see over time about people's preferences. Then you have the conceived values, which is kind of like ideals. The way I think about it is as your ideals. So you may show positive or negative preferential behavior toward signified objects or situations, so things that are not actually present. By this he means something like preferential behavior toward ideas or your ideals. So you may prefer a very strong form of socialism, for example, that doesn't actually exist in the present, but you may believe it's the system of socioeconomic organization that we ought to move towards. So it's kind of an abstract thing that you show preference toward. And then object values. This is emphasizing the objects, of course. So objects and situations have properties that support positive or negative preferential behavior. So on a hot day, you may prefer objects that are cool and avoid objects that are hot. So it's not like your ideal to always prefer cool objects or an operative value in the sense that over time you always prefer cool objects to hot objects, but it's in particular situations. Objects have various properties, and in some situations you prefer objects with this kind of property, and if the situation changes, you'll prefer a different object might be better for you. So Morris says that object values are properties of an object considered in relation to its ability to reinforce preferential behavior directed toward it by some organisms. Properties of an object considered in relation to its ability to reinforce preferential behavior directed toward it by some organism. Yeah, a mouthful. All right, so we've got our three kinds of values. So systems, let's talk about systems. Talks about three aspects of systems, which works into a tridimensionality of values. So it's not that so before we talked about three kinds of values, now these are three dimensions that values have. I think regardless of whether they're operative, conceived, or object values. So talking about systems, for example, an organism is going to be a system. An organization that tends to maintain itself through change is how he defines a system. These are going to end up being dimensions of value, like I said. So you have dependence, dominance, detachment. The three Ds: dependence, dominance, and detachment. Dependence he also calls receptivity. Dependence, systems need stuff from other systems to continue to exist, so they have somewhat permeable boundaries. They depend on or are receptive to other systems. You've got your dependence. Dominance, systems try to control other systems or objects for their own benefit, as animals try to exert control over the objects we call food. So you dominate certain objects in your environment. And then detachment. So the boundaries of a system cannot be too permeable, and it cannot allow other systems to dominate it too much, or it will lose its integrity as a system. It must have some mechanism to maintain a certain independence. So they have to be detached. So each of these things has a value. And let's see here. We've got his stages. So these three dimensions of value are related to or emphasized in the three phases of action: perception, manipulation, consummation, and the three dimensions of signs. This is summarized in Morris's Table 2, stages of action in relation to dimensions of signifying and value. The stages of action: perceptual, manipulatory, consummatory, which have, you focus on designative signs or prescriptive, the prescriptive aspect of signs or the appraisive aspect of signs, which are related to, so perception, you're remaining detached from objects, right? This is before you've decided to engage with them, you perceive them. So this emphasizes the value of detachment. Manipulation emphasizes the value of dominance. So can you manipulate? Can you dominate this object? Is it dominatable? And then consummatory shows the dependence value of the sign, because you get it, you dominate it, and then if it's useful to you, it shows your dependence on it, right? If it's useful or satisfying or whatever, then you have you're dependent on it for that experience All right. So, is there another slide or no? No. So just point out perception. Yeah, I don't think I need to say much more about that. Yeah, the only other thing I had in my notes, if you talk about perception and manipulation and related to detachment and dominance, just I had the idea that it's similar to the power-knowledge dynamic or knowledge-power dynamic that is talked about sometimes in philosophy, related to the work of, I guess, famously associated with Foucault, but many other people have talked about it. So perception, it's kind of like you're gaining knowledge about an object, and then the dominance stage, you're kind of gaining power over it or exerting power over it. And I don't know where consummation would fit into that. But I guess consummation grows out of having power over something, right? Being able to manipulate something. We don't need to take power in a very nefarious way here. You have power over the food you eat or something, the pen you write with. Okay, so I want to finish up with inquiry. We've got our two senses of meaning within the realms of semiotics and axiology. And so having to do with the significations of signs and the significances of values. The significations of signs, significances of values. So how do we find out about meaning when there is some problem making it hard to know? So it's not always hard to know what something means, what its signification or significance is. How do we find out about it? And Morris takes up the term inquiry to talk about this. He's inspired by Dewey's logic, John Dewey's book Logic, the Theory of Inquiry, which I've talked about a little in my video on Dewey. So this is kind of interesting slide. So again, we have three parts, right? You knew it was going to happen. You knew there was going to be more threes. So we've got the tridimensionality of inquiry, designative inquiry, prescriptive inquiry, and appraisive inquiry. So designative inquiry is related to the designative dimension of inquiry is related to what has happened, is happening, or will happen. This is emphasized in the empirical sciences. What has happened, what is happening right now, what probably will happen in the future. Prescriptive inquiry is about what should we do? So given this information, given what's happening, what should we do about it? It's emphasized in technology, probably technology and engineering, that kind of thing. And appraisive inquiry, so problems of what to accord preferential behavior. So how should we feel about it, right? Given what's happening, what we can do about it. So how should we feel? And this is emphasized in criticism, the aesthetic criticism or cultural criticism, social criticism, so on, political criticism, that kind of thing. All forms of inquiry are used at various stages of the inquiry process, but one is usually emphasized as a goal. So we'll see in a moment that there are different fields that deal with different aspects of inquiry. So they're not trying to solve all the problems, but usually taking on one dimension of inquiry. Slide C, table 4. Okay, so table 4, yeah, so he relates all these things together. Forms of inquiry related to action, signs, and values. So you got, again, your stages of action. I think I mislabeled this in the beginning of the video, but too late for me to do much about it now. I'm not going to change it. So you got perceptual, manipulatory, consummatory, and you've got your dimensions of signifying, dimensions of value, and then your inquiry as designative inquiry, prescriptive inquiry, appraisive inquiry. So there's a lot that could be said about this. I just want to point out that we have different cultural institutions to help us figure out meaning in different senses of the word meaning. So I think this is my summary of inquiry. So science, the sciences and disciplines like history help us figure out if signs refer to things that did or do or might exist. So designative inquiry related to science, history, things like that. Prescriptive inquiry, people like engineers, inventors, designers, technology specialists help us figure out what it is possible to do. And then last one, appraisive inquiry. Critics, ethicists, and such people help us figure out what we should prefer. Okay, so it's elegant, I think. It makes sense to me. I know it's been complicated if you made it this far. But it does fit together. It just takes yeah, I don't work with Morris that much. But I think his theory is useful. It's just yeah, getting the hang of it, getting it under your belt can be takes work. Takes work, and he hasn't been super influential, not as popular as other people like Mead or Peirce. I don't hear him discussed as much, although there's some people who really like Morris. So we talked about Morris's theory of meaning in terms of signification and significance. Remember, signification had to do with the meaning of signs as dispositions to act in a certain way in view of a certain object. Meaning here was both the interpretant, the perceiving, doing, feeling, and the object in terms of which these things are done, or felt, or perceived. Significance had to do with the values of things, such as what you prefer or find to be important or reinforcing, to use behaviorist language. So we talked a little also about inquiry just at the end, as finding out about signification and significance. Okay, so anyway, next time I'm going to talk about B.F. Skinner and Charles E. Osgood. I'm going to talk about them together because it's convenient to do so. Skinner I have less to say about. Osgood, like Morris, is super complicated. I just can't handle it, so I'm going to give kind of a brief summary of Osgood's work to the best of my ability and put them together a bit. There's some other reasons to talk about them together, which you can find out about in the next video, but that's all for today. Thank you for watching. If you made it through all of those complexities, congratulations as well. And have a good day. See you later.